The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benning, Georgia, as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward the administration building. It was 1998, and she had been stationed here for 3 years. 3 years of being passed over for promotions, of having her reports ignored, and of watching younger, less experienced men climb the ranks while she remained stuck in her position. Sarah was 42 years old, with silver streaks running through her dark hair that she kept pulled back in a tight military bun. Her uniform was always pressed, her shoes always polished, and her record was spotless. Yet somehow, none of it mattered. The Army had a way of making sure women like her understood their place, useful for paperwork and logistics, but not quite suitable for the positions that truly mattered. She was a historian by training, with a master's degree in American military history that she had earned while serving. Before joining the Army at 35, she had taught high school history in North Carolina. Friends had called her crazy for enlisting so late in life, but Sarah had always felt called to service. Her father had been a soldier. Her grandfather had been a soldier. The call of duty ran through her blood like electricity. But the Army, it seemed, did not want what she had to offer. "Captain Mitchell," a voice called out as she reached the base library. It was Private James Chen, a young soldier who worked in the archives section. He was barely 25, nervous, and always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. "Do you have a minute? I found something. Unusual in the old records. I wasn't sure who to show it to." Sarah glanced at her watch. She had a meeting with Colonel Harrison in 20 minutes, another meeting where she would present research that someone else would present to someone higher up. It was the pattern of her life now, but something in the private's voice made her stop. "What is it?" she asked. James held up a faded folder. The edges were yellowed with age, and the label on the front was barely legible. "I was cataloging some boxes from the warehouse. This one was marked Disposal, 1992. It was supposed to be thrown away, but somebody put it in the wrong bin. Look at this." He opened the folder carefully. Inside were photographs, black and white images of young men in military uniforms, but something was different about them. They looked different from American soldiers. The uniforms were Japanese, and in many of the photos there were American soldiers standing nearby, and in the background of several pictures, Sarah could clearly see the distinctive bottles of Coca-Cola. "Where did you find this?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly quiet. "In a box labeled Fort Benning Historical Records, 1945. There's a whole section of documentation. Invoices, memos, photographs. The whole box, Captain. It's like someone forgot it existed." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She had studied World War II history extensively. She knew about Japanese prisoners of war held in the United States, but she had never seen anything like this before. The presence of Coca-Cola in photographs with what appeared to be Japanese POWs was unusual, very unusual. "James, I need you to do something for me," Sarah said quietly. "Don't mention this to anyone, not yet. Can you make copies of everything in this box, everything?" "Is there something wrong?" James asked, his young face creasing with concern. "I don't know yet," Sarah replied, "but I'm going to find out." She was already late for her meeting with Colonel Harrison. She knew she would be lectured about punctuality, about professionalism, about how officers needed to set an example. She didn't care anymore. Something in those photographs had awakened something in her, a sense of purpose that had been dormant for too long. Colonel Harrison was a man in his 60s, gray-haired and stern, with the kind of face that had been chiseled by decades of military service. He looked at his watch pointedly as Sarah entered his office. "You're late, Captain," he said without looking up from his desk. "I apologize, sir," Sarah said, and she meant it. At least on that front she could still be professional. "I was held up in the archives." "The archives?" Harrison's tone suggested this was somehow beneath him. "Captain, I called you here because General Morrison has requested a summary of our training efficiency reports for the past 2 years. This should take you no more than 3 hours. It's administrative work, exactly the sort of thing your position was created for. Get it done and get it on my desk by tomorrow morning." Sarah had heard variations of this speech hundreds of times. Administrative work, paperwork, clerical tasks. The words stung, even though she should have been used to them by now. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'll have it ready." "And Captain," Harrison added as she turned to leave, "next time, don't be late. There are plenty of officers who would be grateful for the opportunity to serve in your position." The implication was clear. Be grateful for what you have or lose it. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment on the edge of Fort Benning, surrounded by the copies James had made for her. The apartment was sparse. She had never been one for decoration. A couch, a bed, a desk, and shelves full of books. Her life was her work. It always had been. The documents spread across her desk told a story that nobody had told her in any of her classes, any of her research, or any of her years of study. The photographs showed Japanese prisoners of war, hundreds of them, it appeared, working at various locations around Fort Benning in 1945. Some were in fields, working on farms. Others were in industrial settings. And in several photos, the familiar silhouette of Coca-Cola bottles was visible. In some images, American soldiers were distributing the bottles to the Japanese prisoners. But the accompanying documents told a different story entirely. The invoices were dated from March through July of 1945. They showed massive purchases of Coca-Cola, far more than would be needed for American personnel alone. The memos, written in the careful language of military bureaucracy, made careful references to prisoner morale initiatives and worker incentive programs. One memo in particular caught Sarah's eye. It was dated May 15, 1945, and it was written by a Major Edward Kessler, the commanding officer of the prisoner detail at the time. The provision of Coca-Cola to Japanese workers has resulted in a significant increase in labor output. The prisoners appear to respond well to this American commodity, viewing it as a privilege and a sign of fair treatment. I recommend continuing this program through the summer months. The cost is minimal compared to the increased productivity. Furthermore, the morale boost among the prisoners has reduced incidents of attempted escape and has improved overall camp discipline. Sarah read it 3 times, then 4 times. The words were innocuous enough on their surface, but what they implied was staggering. The Army had been using Coca-Cola, an American symbol of comfort, of home, of normality, as a tool to manage prisoners of war. It wasn't evil exactly. It wasn't torture or starvation or abuse, but it was manipulation. It was the use of psychology and consumerism as a weapon of control. And more than that, it suggested that the story of Japanese prisoners of war in America was far more complicated than the simple narratives that had been taught in schools and history books. It suggested that there were layers to this history, layers of commerce, of strategy, of human nature itself. Sarah knew that what she was looking at was not classified information. These documents had been marked for disposal decades ago, but they had been forgotten. Deliberately forgotten, perhaps, hidden away in a warehouse where nobody would think to look for them. She spent the next 3 weeks working 2 jobs. By day, she compiled training efficiency reports for Colonel Harrison, work that she could do in her sleep now. By night, she began to research. She discovered that Fort Benning had indeed held a significant population of Japanese prisoners of war during the final years of World War II. The official records showed about 300 men at any given time, though the documents she had found suggested the number was higher at various points. She found surviving records from other bases around the country. Some had held Japanese POWs, others had not. But nowhere in the official historical record could she find any mention of a systematic program of providing Coca-Cola to prisoners as a morale and productivity tool. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of history, nothing compared to the massive suffering of the war itself, nothing compared to the atomic bombs, the firebombing of cities, the deaths of hundreds of thousands. And yet, it was also a window into something larger, a window into how history was written, what was remembered and what was forgotten, and how the victors of war got to control the narrative. Sarah began to draft a paper. She worked on it late into the nights, researching, writing, rewriting. She contacted academic journals. She reached out to historians she had known from her teaching days. She began to build a case. And then, one afternoon about a month after she had first seen those photographs, Colonel Harrison called her into his office again. "Close the door, Captain," he said. There was something different in his tone this time, something harder. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had learned to read the moods of her superior officers the way other people read weather patterns. "I've been hearing some interesting things about you," Harrison continued. "Apparently, you've been making phone calls, contacting people outside the base, asking questions about historical records, sharing documents." "I'm conducting research, sir," Sarah said carefully, "in my off-duty time." "Research about what exactly?" Sarah made a decision in that moment. She decided not to hedge, not to minimize, not to make herself smaller than she already was. About Japanese prisoners of war who were held at Fort Benning during World War II, she said, and about a company that I believe played a role in their management and treatment. Harrison stared at her for a long moment. And why, he said slowly, would a soldier in the United States Army be interested in digging up old dirt about a private corporation? Because the historical record is incomplete, sir. Because people deserve to know the truth about what happened. The truth, Harrison repeated. Captain Mitchell, let me tell you something about the truth. The truth is a luxury we can't always afford. The truth is complicated. The truth often hurts people who don't deserve to be hurt. The truth can cause problems. And in this case, I'm going to tell you quite clearly, whatever research project you're working on, it needs to stop. Immediately. Sir, I don't think I can do that, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Then you've just made a very serious mistake, Harrison said. As Sarah left his office, she knew that her time at Fort Benning was coming to an end. She had finally, after 3 years of quietly accepting her place in the shadows, stepped into the light. And the military, she was learning, did not tolerate that kind of behavior. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now. Whatever was in those documents, whatever truth was waiting to be uncovered, it was worth the price she was about to pay. Outside, the Georgia sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah stood for a moment, watching it, and thought about the Japanese prisoners who had stood on this same ground 50 years ago. She thought about them drinking Coca-Cola under the watchful eyes of their guards. She thought about their families waiting across an ocean, not knowing if they were alive or dead. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Sarah's research took on a new urgency after her confrontation with Colonel Harrison. She had perhaps weeks left at Fort Benning before she would be transferred or discharged. She knew that once she left, access to these resources would become much more difficult. She began working even later into the nights, sometimes not leaving the base library until midnight. She developed a cover story. She told people she was preparing for a doctoral thesis, a hobby project for her continuing education. Most people didn't ask questions. Nobody seemed particularly interested in what an aging female captain was doing with her off-duty hours. But Private James Chen noticed. He became her unofficial partner in the project, staying late after his shifts to help her copy documents and organize files. Sarah worried about involving him. He was young, with a long career ahead of him, and she didn't want to taint his future with her crusade. But James insisted. My grandfather was in World War II, he told her one evening as they worked. He was in the Pacific Theater. He never liked to talk about it, but near the end of his life, he mentioned something strange. He said that after the war ended, there were things the government didn't want people to know about. Things that weren't exactly crimes, but weren't exactly right either. He said it was like America wanted the war to be simple, good guys and bad guys, clear victory and clear defeat. But that wasn't how it really was. I want to understand what he meant. So Sarah and James worked together, building a timeline, organizing evidence, reaching out to historians and veterans organizations. And slowly, a network began to form. Other people became interested: academics, retired military officers, descendants of prisoners of war. Then in early September, Sarah received an email that changed everything. It was from a man named Robert Takahashi, who lived in San Francisco. His message was brief. Captain Mitchell, I heard about your research through a colleague at Berkeley. My father was a prisoner of war at Fort Benning in 1945. He passed away in 1987, but before he died, he wrote down his memories in Japanese. My mother translated them after his death. I have been trying to find someone who would be interested in his story for years. I believe I have finally found that person. Would you be willing to meet with me? I would like to share my father's words with someone who will understand their significance. Sarah read the email 5 times. Her hands were trembling as she typed her response. A week later, she was on a plane to San Francisco, using vacation time she had accrued over the past year. Fort Benning seemed very far away as she walked up to Robert Takahashi's house in the hills above the city. It was a beautiful home, filled with light and the smell of jasmine. Robert was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes. He greeted her with a bow, which she returned as respectfully as she could. They sat in his living room, and he brought out a leather journal, worn from handling. Inside were pages of handwriting in Japanese, alongside carefully typed English translations done in blue ink, presumably by his mother. "My father's name was Kenji Takahashi," Robert told her. "He was a soldier in the Imperial Army. He was captured at the end of the war when the Americans were island-hopping closer and closer to Japan. He spent his final months in prison camps, including Fort Benning. He survived the war and returned to Japan, where he married my mother and built a good life. But he never forgot what happened to him. And he never forgot the kindness that was shown to him by some Americans and the cruelty shown by others." Robert opened the journal to a section in the middle. "Here," he said, "this is what he wrote about Coca-Cola." Sarah leaned forward and read the translated words. "Today they gave us Coca-Cola. The American guard said it was a gift, a token of respect from the American military. I had never tasted such a drink before. It was cold and sweet and unlike anything we had in Japan. The other prisoners and I drank it carefully, as if we might break it. We knew that drinking it was an act of survival. We knew that accepting it meant we were saying yes to something, perhaps saying yes to living. Some of the older men refused it. They said it was poison, that the Americans were trying to corrupt us, but most of us drank it. I drank it, and I felt alive for the first time in many months. But I also felt ashamed, because I knew that the Coca-Cola was not a gift at all. It was a test. It was a way of seeing how far they could make us go, how much they could make us abandon of ourselves by offering us one simple pleasure." Sarah sat back slowly, her eyes burning. "He understood," she said softly. "He understood what was happening." "Yes," Robert said. "My father was a philosopher in his way. He understood that war is not just about guns and bombs. It is also about the mind. It is about what we believe about ourselves and each other. The Coca-Cola was innocent, perhaps, but what it represented was not innocent. It was a new kind of warfare, the warfare of consumer goods and comfortable captivity. After the war, my father realized that this was the future. He said that America would win the world not through force, but through making everyone want the things America had. He said Coca-Cola was just the beginning." "Did he ever speak about this with anyone?" Sarah asked. "Did he ever try to document this formally?" Robert shook his head. "He tried once. In the 1970s, he contacted a Japanese historical society and tried to share his memoirs, but they were not interested. They said his story was too personal, too individual. They wanted stories of heroism, not stories of complexity. He gave up after that." Robert spent the next hours sharing more of his father's writings with Sarah. There were descriptions of the camp, descriptions of the food, descriptions of the work the prisoners had been made to do. There were also descriptions of individual American soldiers, some kind, some cruel, some simply indifferent. There was no clear villain in Kenji Takahashi's account, but rather a complex picture of human beings trying to survive war in their own ways. But the most significant passages were those about Coca-Cola. Over several months in 1945, the American military at Fort Benning had gradually increased the availability of the drink to prisoners. At first, it was rare, a special treat given only to prisoners who had worked exceptionally hard or shown excellent behavior. But gradually, it became more common. By the final months of the war, it was almost routine. Kenji had written, "I believe the Americans were running an experiment. They wanted to see if they could make enemies into consumers. They wanted to see if they could break down our cultural identity by offering us their cultural products. And they succeeded. By the end of my captivity, I craved Coca-Cola the way I craved home. I knew it was a weapon against me, and yet I could not resist it. That is the power of America, I think. Not military power, but the power to make people want what you are selling." On her last evening in San Francisco, Sarah sat in the backyard of Robert's home, looking out over the city lights. Robert joined her with 2 glasses of water. "What will you do with my father's words?" he asked. "I'm going to publish them," Sarah said. "Somehow, I'm going to make sure that people know what he experienced. I'm going to make sure his voice is heard." "That may not be easy," Robert said. "No," Sarah agreed, "it won't be." When Sarah returned to Fort Benning, she knew that her days there were limited. She began making copies of everything, not just the documents James had found, but also copies of Kenji Takahashi's translated memoirs. She reached out to academic journals. She contacted historians at major universities. She began building a file, a comprehensive record of what she had discovered. And then, 3 weeks after she returned from San Francisco, she received a notice in her mailbox. She was being transferred. Her new assignment would be to Fort Hood in Texas, effective immediately. The transfer notice came with no explanation, but Sarah knew exactly what had happened. Her inquiries, her research, her reaching out to people outside the military structure. All of it had been noted and reported. The military had decided that the easiest way to deal with her was to move her away from the place where her research had begun. She packed her apartment quietly. She said goodbye to Private Chen, who was devastated. She had one final meeting with Colonel Harrison, who looked at her with a mixture of contempt and something that might have been pity. "You've made a choice, Captain," he said. "I hope it was worth it." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I believe it was." As the plane lifted off the tarmac at Atlanta, Sarah looked out the window and saw Fort Benning below her, growing smaller and smaller. She had spent 3 years there trying to become invisible. In the end, she had become too visible, too loud, too much of a problem to ignore. But she also knew something else. She knew that she had awakened something in herself that could never be put back to sleep. She had glimpsed the truth, and the truth had changed her forever. In Texas, Sarah found herself more isolated than ever. Fort Hood was a massive base, and her new position was deliberately meaningless. She was assigned to a training command that seemed designed to keep her busy with busy work. She had minimal access to archives, minimal support for research, minimal connection to the academic world that she had begun to build in Georgia. But she had something more important than access or support. She had determination. And she had the support of people like Robert Takahashi and Private James Chen, who continued to send her documents and information. And she had something else, a story that refused to stay hidden, a truth that wanted desperately to be told. The years at Fort Hood were difficult. Sarah was now in her mid-40s, and her career had effectively stalled. She would remain a captain for as long as she stayed in the Army, watching younger officers be promoted around her. Her efficiency reports were good but unremarkable. She was rated as meets expectations and nothing more. It was the kiss of death in a military career. Most people would have quit. Most people would have taken the hint and moved on to civilian life, to a teaching position or a library job where their expertise would be valued. Sarah considered it many times. She updated her resume. She looked at job postings for history professors and museum curators. She imagined what it would be like to have a normal life, a life where she didn't spend 8 hours a day doing work she could do with her eyes closed. But every time she was about to press send on an application, she would open the file on her computer, the file that contained everything she had gathered about Japanese prisoners of war at Fort Benning and Coca-Cola. And she would remember why she was doing this. She became a ghost in the Army. She showed up to work, did her job, and said nothing. She didn't attend social functions. She didn't volunteer for extra assignments. She was present but invisible, the kind of officer that other people forgot about between meetings. But outside of work, she became someone else entirely. Sarah began taking online college courses in journalism and historical methodology. She wrote papers for academic journals, papers that were consistently rejected, though the rejection letters often included encouraging feedback. She built a website dedicated to the history of Japanese prisoners of war in America, including Kenji Takahashi's memoirs, the documents from Fort Benning, and her own research. The website attracted attention. Slowly, quietly, other people began finding it. Descendants of prisoners of war from Japan reached out. American historians interested in overlooked aspects of World War II got in touch. A few journalists became intrigued by the story. One journalist in particular became important to Sarah. His name was Michael Torres, and he worked for a major newspaper in Dallas. He had found Sarah's website while researching a completely different story, but he had been immediately intrigued. "This is real," he told her when they first spoke on the phone. "This is a genuine historical gap in the narrative. People should know about this." "People won't care," Sarah said. "It's not dramatic enough, there's no villain, there's no clear victim, it's just complexity." "That's exactly why it matters," Michael replied. "Because it shows that history isn't simple. Because it shows that even the good guys, even America, had complicated relationships with power and control. That's important, Captain Mitchell. That's very important." Michael began researching the story in earnest. He contacted the Coca-Cola company, asking them if they had any records of sales to the military during World War II. He reached out to the National Archives. He conducted interviews with descendants of Japanese prisoners of war. He began building a larger, more comprehensive version of the story that Sarah had been working on alone. And then, in 2002, an article appeared in the Dallas Morning News. The headline read, America's Sweet Captivity, the untold story of Coca-Cola and Japanese prisoners of war. The article was long, well-researched, and deeply sympathetic to both the prisoners and to the complexity of the situation. It quoted Kenji Takahashi's memoirs extensively. It included interviews with historians. It raised important questions about consumerism, war, and American cultural imperialism. It was also widely ignored. Major newspapers picked up a few snippets, but the story never gained real traction nationally. The Coca-Cola Company issued a brief statement saying that they had no records of any organized program to provide their products to prisoners of war, and that if such provision had occurred, it had been entirely under military direction. End of story. But something had shifted. The truth was now in the public record, even if few people were paying attention to it. Sarah's website traffic increased. She began receiving emails from researchers, from descendants of prisoners of war, from people interested in overlooked aspects of military history. More importantly, she caught the attention of someone else. In late 2002, Sarah received a letter. It was from Dr. Patricia Hammond, a historian at the University of North Carolina and a leading expert on World War II and the home front. Patricia had read the Dallas newspaper article and had tracked down Sarah through her website. The letter was handwritten, on elegant stationery. Dear Captain Mitchell, I was fascinated by your research on Japanese prisoners of war and Coca-Cola. I am working on a comprehensive history of how American consumer goods were deployed during and after World War II as tools of cultural influence and control. Your work fits perfectly into a larger narrative that I am developing. I would very much like to collaborate with you on a more detailed academic study of this phenomenon. Would you be interested in meeting with me to discuss this further? I believe your research deserves to be published in a way that reaches serious scholars and historians. Sincerely, Dr. Patricia Hammond. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time. She read it multiple times, as if it might disappear if she didn't read it enough. She took leave from Fort Hood and drove to Chapel Hill. Dr. Hammond's office was in a historic building on campus, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. Patricia herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes. She greeted Sarah warmly and immediately offered her tea. Tell me everything, Patricia said, and don't leave anything out. Over the course of 2 days, Sarah told her entire story. She showed her the documents, the photographs, Kenji's translated memoirs, Michael's article. She told her about her experience at Fort Benning, about the transfer to Fort Hood, about the years of isolation and rejection. Patricia listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, occasionally making notes. When Sarah had finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. This is extraordinary, Patricia finally said. Not just because it's an overlooked historical detail, though it certainly is that, but because it's an example of how history is constructed and maintained. The fact that this story has been forgotten or suppressed or simply ignored, that's the real story. That's what we need to explore. Patricia offered Sarah something that nobody else had offered her in a long time: respect. Not pity, not condescension, but genuine professional respect for her work. I want to include your research in my book, Patricia said. It will be published by Oxford University Press. I'll make sure you're properly credited, and I think we should try to publish your findings as a standalone chapter in a peer-reviewed journal. Your work deserves that platform. But I'm not a historian, Sarah said. I'm a soldier. I don't have a PhD. I don't have academic credentials. You have research, Patricia said. You have sources, you have evidence, you have something to say. That's what matters. The rest is just paperwork. Over the next 2 years, Sarah worked with Patricia on a detailed academic study of consumer goods and cultural imperialism in the context of World War II. Patricia helped her strengthen her arguments, fill in gaps in her research, and develop her ideas in more sophisticated ways. Together, they expanded the study to look not just at Coca-Cola and Japanese prisoners of war, but at a broader pattern of how American consumer goods had been used by the military as tools of control and integration. The work was published in a respected academic journal in 2004, with Sarah as the lead author. The chapter in Patricia's book came out in 2005. Suddenly, after years of being ignored and dismissed, Sarah's research was being read and discussed by historians, by scholars, by people who mattered in the academic world. But Sarah's life in the Army was still stalled. She was still a captain. She was still doing meaningless work. The military had not recognized her academic achievements. The military did not care about her published research. In fact, her military superiors seemed actively hostile to her scholarly work. When her commanding officer found out about her publications, he called her into his office. "I don't care what you do in your off-duty time," he said, "but I want to make sure you understand something. The Army is not pleased with the attention you're bringing to certain sensitive historical matters. We have relationships with allies and with defense contractors, and we don't appreciate narratives that complicate those relationships. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, though she didn't understand. She didn't understand how telling the truth about history could be seen as a threat. She didn't understand how the military could be hostile to historical scholarship. But she was beginning to understand that truth was a more complicated thing than she had ever realized. Truth was not automatically valued. Truth was not always welcomed. Truth could be a threat to the people in power. In 2005, at the age of 50, Sarah made a decision. She put in her retirement papers. She had completed 20 years of service, most of that before she had even joined the Army, and then 5 years in uniform. She had enough time to qualify for a military pension. She had given half of her adult life to the Army, and the Army had given her nothing but rejection and isolation. But Sarah was not leaving empty-handed. She was leaving with something far more valuable than a promotion or a better position. She was leaving with the knowledge that she had done something that mattered. She had uncovered a truth that had been hidden. She had given voice to people who had been silenced. She had published work that was being read and discussed in universities around the world. As she walked out of Fort Hood for the last time in her dress uniform, Sarah felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt free. Sarah's life after the Army was dramatically different. She moved back to North Carolina and joined the faculty at the University of Chapel Hill as a visiting lecturer. She was not a tenured professor. The university would not offer her that level of security without a PhD, which she had never pursued. But she taught courses on World War II history, on the American home front, on the intersection of commerce and military power. Her classes filled quickly. Her students loved her. Her research continued to attract attention. She and Patricia Hammond became close friends and frequent collaborators. Together, they began expanding their work on consumer goods and war. They started a research center at the university dedicated to studying how corporations had worked with the military during World War II. Sarah found herself in demand at academic conferences. She published papers regularly. She was invited to give lectures at universities around the country. But the most significant opportunity came in 2007, when she received a call from a documentary filmmaker named James Lee. James had discovered her research while working on a large-scale documentary about Japanese prisoners of war in America during World War II. "I want to make a full documentary about your work," James told her. "I want to explore not just the Coca-Cola story, but the larger context of how America treated Japanese prisoners of war and how corporations played a role in that treatment. It's an important story, and I think your research is the key to understanding it." Over the next 2 years, James and Sarah worked intensively on the documentary. They traveled to Japan, where they met with surviving prisoners of war and their families. They interviewed Kenji Takahashi's daughter, Robert's sister, who shared memories of her father's experiences. They conducted new research in the National Archives. They interviewed historians and military historians and corporate historians. And then, slowly, something began to happen. The documentary caught the attention of mainstream media. A major newspaper ran a feature story about Sarah and her research. A television network expressed interest in making a limited series about overlooked stories from World War II, and Sarah's story became the centerpiece. Suddenly, at the age of 54, Sarah Mitchell was becoming famous. Not in the military world, she had left that behind. But in the academic world, in the media world, in the world of historical scholarship, she had become something of a celebrity. But success, she learned, had its own complications. The documentary, titled The Sweet Prison, Coca-Cola and War, premiered at a major film festival in 2009 to significant acclaim. The Coca-Cola company was not pleased. They issued a strong statement denying any involvement in organizing any program to provide their products to prisoners of war, and suggesting that the documentary was making unfounded accusations against a company that had been patriotic during World War II. "The Coca-Cola Company," the statement read, has a long history of serving America and our service members. Any suggestion that we participated in unethical practices is false and defamatory. Our products have brought joy and comfort to millions of people around the world. We stand by our company's proud history and our commitment to ethical business practices. The statement was polished, professional, and completely missed the point. Sarah had never accused Coca-Cola of wrongdoing. She had simply documented what had happened, that their products had been provided to prisoners of war as a tool of control and morale management. The company's defensive response, in many ways, proved her point. They understood that her work was damaging to their carefully constructed narrative of wholesome patriotism. But Coca-Cola did more than just issue a statement. They hired a team of lawyers and researchers to challenge Sarah's work. They commissioned their own historical study, claiming to show that the documentary had been inaccurate and that Sarah had misrepresented the facts. The response was sophisticated and well-funded. Coca-Cola's hired historians argued that while the company had sold products to the military during the war, there had been no systematic program specifically designed to provide Coca-Cola to prisoners of war. They argued that any provision of their products to prisoners had been incidental, a side effect of normal military supply procedures, not a deliberate strategy. But as Sarah dug deeper into Coca-Cola's records, which the company had been forced to open through a combination of media pressure and legal discovery, she found something that contradicted their position. There was internal correspondence from 1944 and 1945, showing that executives at Coca-Cola had been aware that their products were being provided to prisoners of war, and that they had been pleased by this development because it was expanding their market reach and brand awareness among a population that had previously never had access to American consumer goods. One memo in particular was damaging to Coca-Cola's version of events. It was written by a mid-level executive named Robert Patterson and addressed to the company's marketing department. Gentlemen, we have an unprecedented opportunity before us. Through our military channels, we have the ability to reach millions of people around the world who have never tasted Coca-Cola. This includes prisoners of war from Japan and Germany. We should view this as an opportunity, not a problem. These men will return to their home countries and carry with them the memory of our product. They will be ambassadors for Coca-Cola. The goodwill we create now will pay dividends for decades to come. I recommend that we continue supporting military operations that place our products in the hands of foreign prisoners, not out of charity, but out of strategic interest. When this memo became public, the Coca-Cola company's credibility took a serious hit. It became clear that they had been deliberate in their strategy, not accidental. They had understood that they were using prisoners of war as test subjects for brand loyalty. They had calculated that the investment was worth it because of the long-term market advantage. Sarah held a press conference after the memo was released. She stood in front of the cameras, looking composed but angry. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "The Coca-Cola company is not evil. They did not torture prisoners of war. They did not commit war crimes. But they did something that, in its own way, was more insidious. They understood that human beings could be manipulated through the promise of comfort and pleasure. They understood that brand loyalty could be created through strategic provision of consumer goods. And they acted on that understanding, knowing full well that they were doing it to prisoners of war, people who had no choice, no agency, no way to refuse. That is not evil, but it is not innocent either. It is calculated. It is manipulative, and it represents something important about how power works in the world." The press conference went viral. Sarah's face was on news programs around the country. Her research was being discussed in major newspapers. She had become the public face of the story of Japanese prisoners of war and American corporate exploitation. But she had also made powerful enemies. Coca-Cola fought back aggressively. They filed lawsuits against the documentary makers, claiming defamation. They contacted university administrators, pointing out that Sarah was being funded by state money and questioning whether her research met academic standards. They reached out to Sarah's colleagues, suggesting that her work was more activism than scholarship. Some of Sarah's colleagues began to distance themselves from her. Not Patricia. Patricia stood by her friend completely. But others who had been friendly began to avoid her. She was offered fewer speaking opportunities. Some academic conferences rejected her submission for papers. It became clear that Coca-Cola's influence extended into the academic and media worlds far more than Sarah had realized. And then, in the fall of 2010, something happened that shocked Sarah to her core. Michael Torres, the journalist who had written the original article about her research in the Dallas Morning News, died in what was officially ruled a car accident. He had been driving alone on a rural road at night when his car had left the road and hit a tree. He had been killed instantly. Sarah attended his funeral in Dallas. At the reception afterward, Michael's widow, Alina, took Sarah aside. "I need to tell you something," Alina said quietly. Michael was scared near the end. He had received some threats, nothing explicit but clear enough, and he had been contacted by someone from Coca-Cola offering him money if he would write a follow-up article refuting his original work. He refused, obviously, but he was worried. He told me he was worried about what might happen if he continued pushing the story. Sarah felt cold. She wanted to dismiss the implication that Coca-Cola would do something to silence Michael. It seemed paranoid, conspiratorial, and yet the coincidence was troubling. "I don't know what happened to Michael," Alina continued. "But I know that he was scared, and I know that the accident was convenient for some people. I wanted you to know that. I wanted someone to know." Sarah reported her conversation with Alina to the police, but nothing came of it. The car accident was ruled an accident. There was no evidence of foul play. Michael's death became another tragedy, another loss, another reminder of how fragile life was. But it also changed something in Sarah. She realized that there were real consequences to speaking the truth. There were real costs to challenging powerful institutions. Michael Torres had paid a price that Sarah had not. After Michael's death, Sarah became cautious in ways she had not been before. She increased her security. She was careful about where she went and who she met with. She had her car serviced regularly, and she varied her routines. She probably seemed paranoid to the people around her, and perhaps she was. But she was also taking her safety seriously in a way that many people would have considered reasonable given the circumstances. The academic world around her continued to change as well. Coca-Cola's influence was less visible than before. They had stopped filing lawsuits and threatening legal action, but it was also less necessary. The company had succeeded in muddying the waters. Historians and journalists who had initially been excited about Sarah's research became more cautious. The story had become tainted by the legal battles, by the corporate response, by the specter of Michael's death. Sarah continued to teach at the university and to write, but she was aware that she was increasingly isolated. She had won the battle. Her research was published. Her work was in the historical record. Her findings were documented and verified. But she was losing the war for public opinion. Coca-Cola had survived her accusations largely intact, and public interest in the story had waned. It was Patricia who suggested that Sarah consider writing a book. Not an academic book, but a narrative history, something that told the story of Sarah's research journey as well as the historical story she had uncovered. "People need to understand not just what you found," Patricia said, "but why it matters. They need to understand the cost of discovering this truth." So Sarah began to write. She wrote about her experience in the army, about the frustration of being overlooked and dismissed. She wrote about the documents she had discovered, and about Kenji Takahashi's profound understanding of what Coca-Cola represented. She wrote about her collaboration with Patricia and Michael and Robert Takahashi and the other people who had helped her along the way. She wrote about Michael's death and what it meant to her. The book, titled The Sweet Prison, One Woman's Quest to Uncover the Hidden History of War and Commerce, was published in 2012 by a major publishing house. It became a bestseller, far more successful than any academic article could ever have been. Suddenly, Sarah's story was reaching people who would never have read a scholarly journal. And with that success came something unexpected. In 2013, Sarah received an invitation to speak at the Library of Congress. It was an honor, one of the highest honors that could be bestowed on an historian. She would be speaking about her research, and her work would be added to the Library of Congress archives. It was during her visit to Washington, D.C. for this event that Sarah received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Captain Mitchell," a man's voice said, "my name is Senator Robert Chen. I wonder if you might have time to meet with me." They met in a quiet coffee shop near the Capitol. Senator Chen was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and a measured, careful way of speaking. He had been a senator for many years and had a reputation as a moderate, someone who tried to find common ground between parties. "I have read your book," Senator Chen said without preamble. "I have also been reading the academic papers you have published. I have been following your research for some time now, Captain Mitchell, and I want to tell you why. He proceeded to explain. His father had been in the military during World War II. His father had been stationed at Fort Benning during the same period that Japanese prisoners of war had been held there. Recently, as his father was dying, he had told his son something that had troubled him for 60 years, that he had witnessed the military deliberately providing consumer goods to prisoners of war as a means of psychological control and indoctrination. My father said, Senator Chen continued, that the military had understood something about how war works in the modern age. He said it wasn't just about military superiority. It was about changing how people thought, what they wanted, who they identified with. He said that Coca-Cola was an experiment in that kind of warfare, and he said that the military had learned from that experiment and had applied those lessons in other contexts. What other contexts? Sarah asked. That, Senator Chen said carefully, is what I would like to talk to you about, and it's why I wanted to meet with you in person rather than through any official channels. Senator Chen explained that he had become increasingly interested in the history of American foreign policy and military strategy in the post-World War II era. He believed that there were patterns of how America used corporate partnerships and consumer goods to achieve military and political objectives. He believed that what had happened at Fort Benning with Coca-Cola had been a proof of concept for something much larger. I think, Senator Chen said, that the story you have uncovered is part of a much larger story, and I think that the government does not want that larger story to be told. What larger story? Sarah asked. That is what I need your help figuring out, Senator Chen replied. I have some classified documents that I have cleared to access as a senator on the relevant committees. They pertain to military intelligence operations and corporate partnerships. I cannot share them with you directly because that would be illegal, but I can arrange for you to meet with someone who can, someone who has dedicated their career to researching this question and who has access to resources that I do not. That someone turned out to be a woman named Dr. Helen Vasquez, who worked for the State Department as a historian and policy analyst. Helen was in her 50s, with an air of someone who had seen too much and believed too little. She met with Sarah in a secure conference room in a government building. What Senator Chen told you is true, Helen said. There is a larger pattern here. After World War II, the American government and American corporations worked together to reshape the world in America's image, and consumer goods were part of that strategy. Coca-Cola was one example, but there were others. American movies, American music, American fashion, American food. These were all deliberately deployed as tools of cultural influence and control. Helen showed Sarah documents, some declassified, some in gray areas of classification, that supported this narrative. There were internal government memos discussing the strategic value of American consumer goods in gaining influence over newly decolonized nations and ideological rivals. There were corporate documents showing how the government had arranged for companies to provide products to American allies at reduced costs, or sometimes at no cost at all, in order to create brand loyalty and cultural dependency. This isn't a conspiracy, Helen said. It's not secret in the way that people think conspiracies are secret. It's documented, it's understood, it's part of the historical record. But it's also not talked about because it complicates the narrative of American benevolence. America likes to think of itself as always acting out of good intentions, but the truth is more complicated. America has understood for a very long time that power can be exercised through the provision of pleasure and comfort. That understanding is not unique to America. It's a general principle of how power works, but America has been very good at it. Over the next several months, Sarah met with Helen repeatedly. She was given access to declassified documents and to information that had been carefully compiled over decades of research. Helen had been working on this larger narrative for years, but she needed someone like Sarah, someone with credibility in the academic community, someone with a track record of rigorous research, someone who had already established that she was willing to challenge powerful institutions. In late 2013, Sarah and Helen published a long article together in a top-tier academic journal titled American Power and the Business of Desire, Consumer Goods as Tools of Empire, 1945-1965. The article generated significant attention. It was cited in other academic work. It was discussed in policy circles. It raised important questions about how American power had operated in the post-war world. But it also generated a response. The federal government was not pleased with the article. Helen was interviewed by people from the FBI. She was told that she had crossed lines, that she had released sensitive information, that her security clearance was under review. More significantly, Helen received a call from her supervisor at the State Department telling her that her position was being eliminated as part of a reorganization. She was given 3 months to find another job or face termination. "They're pushing me out," Helen told Sarah when they met for what would turn out to be the last time. "Not directly because that would be too obvious, but indirectly clearly, and I'm not going to fight them. I'm 62. I've had a long career. I'm ready to move on." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "You didn't do anything wrong," Helen replied. "You just told the truth, and sometimes the truth has costs. That's not your fault. That's just how the world works." Helen retired from government service and moved to Vermont, where she became an independent researcher and consultant. She and Sarah remained in touch, but the intensity of their collaboration ended. The government had sent a message, and both Sarah and Helen understood it. But Sarah was not intimidated. If anything, she was galvanized. She realized that she had been given a gift, the gift of understanding how power really worked, how institutions really responded to threats to their narratives. She had spent her whole life accepting the official stories, accepting the narratives that were handed to her. Now she understood that those narratives were constructed, maintained, and defended by powerful institutions that would go to great lengths to protect them. She thought about Michael Tors, and she thought about the car accident that might or might not have been an accident. She thought about Helen being pushed out of her job. She thought about her own years of isolation and rejection in the military. She thought about all the people throughout history who had tried to tell the truth and had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. By 2015, Sarah Mitchell was 58 years old. She had published a best-selling book. She had published numerous academic articles. She had been featured on news programs, in newspapers, and documentaries. She had been given honors and awards for her work. By most measures, she had succeeded. She had achieved what most scholars only dream of. She had uncovered an important truth, and she had shared it with the world. But she also knew that she was only telling part of the story. There was a larger narrative, the narrative that Helen Vasquez had begun to uncover, the narrative that Senator Chen believed was central to understanding how American power worked in the post-war world. And that narrative had been suppressed, protected, defended by powerful institutions. Sarah had a choice to make. She could stop here. She could enjoy her success, her reputation, her accomplishments. She could live a quiet life as a respected historian at the university. She could give up the quest to understand the larger story. Or she could keep pushing. She could keep digging. She could keep trying to tell truths that powerful people did not want told. The choice seemed obvious when she thought about it in the abstract. Of course she should keep pushing. Of course she should keep telling the truth. But when she thought about Michael Tors, when she thought about Helen's job being eliminated, when she thought about the years of isolation and rejection she had already suffered, the choice became less clear. She was having these thoughts one evening in early 2015 when she received a visitor at her home in Chapel Hill. It was Robert Takahashi, whom she had not seen in person since she had visited him in San Francisco more than 15 years earlier. "I wanted to thank you," Robert said after they had greeted each other and settled down with tea. "I wanted to thank you for what you have done with my father's words. You have given them a new life. You have shared them with a world that might never have heard them otherwise. My father died believing that his story would die with him, but because of you, his story lives on." "I wish I could have done more," Sarah said. "I wish the world had paid more attention. I wish the story had changed more things." "But it has changed things," Robert said. "Not in obvious ways, perhaps, but in the way that truth changes things. People now know, scholars now know, historians now know that is not nothing." "But there is more," Sarah said. "There is a larger story, and I am not sure I have the courage to tell it." She explained to Robert what she had learned from Helen Vasquez, what she had begun to understand about how American power had operated in the post-war world. She told him about the government pressure, about Helen being pushed out of her job, about the implicit threats. "I want to keep digging," Sarah said, "but I am afraid. I am afraid of what I will find, and I am afraid of what the consequences will be." Robert was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "My father," he finally said, "spent the last 50 years of his life thinking about his time as a prisoner of war. He thought about Coca-Cola. He thought about Americanism. He thought about power and comfort and how they shape people. Near the end of his life, he told me something. He said that the worst thing that can happen to a human being is not suffering or pain or even death. The worst thing that can happen to a human being is to stop asking questions. He said that once you stop asking questions, you become asleep. And an asleep person, even if they are walking and talking, is already dead. That is a profound thing to say, Sarah said. Yes, Robert agreed. And I think my father would want me to encourage you to keep asking questions, even if the answers are difficult, even if the answers make you uncomfortable, even if the answers have consequences, because the alternative is to become asleep. And you are not an asleep person, Captain Mitchell. You never have been. After Robert left, Sarah made her decision. She would continue the work. She would try to understand the larger narrative. She would push forward, even knowing that there might be costs. She began by reaching out to her academic network. She contacted historians at major universities who had shown interest in her work. She reached out to journalists who had covered her story. She began asking questions about American use of consumer goods as tools of cultural influence in the post-war period. She asked for leads on primary sources, on archives, on people who might know more about this history. What she found was both encouraging and troubling. There was substantial academic interest in the question of how American power had operated in the post-war world. There were scholars who had been researching this topic for years, who had found patterns in declassified documents and historical records. But there was also a sense of caution, a feeling that some doors were better left unopened. Over the course of the next 2 years, Sarah worked on a new book project, a more ambitious book that would try to tell the larger story of how America had used corporate partnerships and consumer goods to expand its influence around the world. She conducted interviews. She reviewed newly declassified documents. She worked with Helen Vasquez in Vermont, who served as a consultant despite her official distance from the project. The research was difficult, sometimes frightening. There were moments when Sarah was not entirely sure if she was being paranoid or prudent in her caution. There were times when she thought someone was following her, and she wasn't sure if that was real or imagined. There were times when her computer seemed to be behaving strangely, and she wasn't sure if it had been hacked or if she was just anxious. But she also knew something important. She was no longer alone. There were other people who believed in this work. There were other historians and researchers and journalists who cared about telling the truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable or threatening to powerful institutions. And then in early 2017, something surprising happened. The national news started reporting on a story about corporate influence in foreign policy. A major newspaper had obtained a cache of declassified documents that showed exactly what Sarah had been researching, evidence of deliberate coordination between the American government and corporations to use consumer goods and brand development as tools of cultural imperialism during the Cold War and beyond. The story was broken by a team of investigative journalists who had been working on it for years. Sarah was not directly involved in the story, but her research was cited extensively. Her book about Coca-Cola and Japanese prisoners of war was referenced as an early example of this larger pattern of corporate and military coordination. Suddenly, Sarah's work was in the spotlight again. The story she had told about Fort Benning and Coca-Cola was being presented not as an isolated incident, but as part of a comprehensive strategy that America had employed for decades. The narrative that had once seemed marginal, academic, insignificant suddenly became central to a major news story about how American foreign policy actually worked. And more importantly, the story had been broken by journalists and scholars and researchers who were powerful enough and numerous enough that they could not be easily silenced or suppressed. This was not Helen Vasquez working alone in the State Department. This was a coordinated effort by multiple media organizations, multiple research institutions, multiple academic centers. The Coca-Cola company tried to respond, but their response seemed small and inadequate compared to the scale of the story that was now being told. They issued statements asserting their patriotism and their ethical business practices, but these statements seemed hollow in the context of a larger narrative about corporate and military collaboration that spanned decades. Sarah was invited to appear on national news programs to discuss her research. She was asked to testify before a congressional committee that was investigating the history of corporate influence in foreign policy. She found herself, at the age of 60, becoming the public face of a story that reached far beyond Japanese prisoners of war and Coca-Cola. But more importantly, she found herself vindicated. The research that she had conducted at great personal cost, that she had pursued despite isolation and rejection and veiled threats, was now being recognized as important and valuable. The truth that she had uncovered had not changed the world, but it had changed how the world understood itself. One afternoon in 2017, Sarah was sitting in her office at the university when she received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "Captain Mitchell," a woman's voice said. "My name is Lisa Torres. I'm Michael Torres' daughter. I wonder if you might have time to speak with me." They met at the same coffee shop in Dallas where Sarah had spoken with Alina after Michael's funeral. Lisa was in her 30s now, a journalist herself, following in her father's footsteps. "I wanted to thank you," Lisa said, "for what you did. My father believed in your research. He believed it was important. And I think if he were here to see what's happening now, he would be proud. I think he would be proud that his death, whatever the cause, did not stop the story from being told." "I often think about your father," Sarah said. "I often wonder if I caused his death." "No," Lisa said firmly. "You didn't cause his death. He chose to pursue the truth just like you did. That was his choice, just like your choices have been your own. You can't be responsible for other people's agency. You can only be responsible for your own." They talked for a long time about Michael, about journalism, about the price of telling the truth. Lisa told Sarah that she was working on a documentary about her father's life and legacy, and that she would like to feature Sarah in that documentary, discussing Michael's role in uncovering the Coca-Cola story. "I would be honored," Sarah said. In 2018, Sarah retired from the university with emeritus status. She was 61 years old. She had spent the last 25 years trying to uncover and tell the truth about a chapter of history that most people wanted to forget. She had paid a price for that work. She had sacrificed career advancement in the military. She had endured years of isolation and rejection. She had lived with uncertainty and occasionally with fear. But she had also discovered something valuable. She had discovered that truth, even when suppressed and attacked and threatened, had a way of emerging. She had discovered that there were other people in the world who believed in the importance of that truth. She had discovered that one person, working patiently and persistently, could make a difference. She had also discovered herself. The overlooked soldier who had been passed over and dismissed had become a recognized scholar and historian. The woman who had been told to stay in her lane had helped to change how people understood American history and American power. On the day she retired from the university, the history department held a small celebration in her honor. Patricia Hammond gave a speech about Sarah's contributions to historical scholarship. Her colleagues and students gave testimonials about the impact of her teaching and research. At the end of the event, the department gave her a gift, a leather-bound book containing reprints of all of her published articles, along with letters from scholars around the world who had been influenced by her work. As Sarah held the book, she thought about the scared soldier at Fort Benning more than 20 years earlier, who had discovered those forgotten documents in a dusty archive. She thought about how that discovery had changed everything. She thought about Kenji Takahashi, who had written down his memories of Coca-Cola and captivity and American power, never knowing that his words would one day help to reshape how the world understood history. She thought about Michael Torres, who had believed in the importance of the story and had paid a price for that belief. She thought about all the people throughout history who had asked uncomfortable questions, who had challenged official narratives, who had insisted on telling truths that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. And she thought about the world she was leaving behind, a world that was slightly different because one woman had refused to be silent, refused to accept the official story, refused to stop asking questions. The documentary about Sarah's life and work, filmed by James Lee and including material from Lisa Torres' documentary about her father, premiered at a major film festival in 2019. It was called The Overlooked, and it told the story not just of Sarah's research but of her journey, her struggle to be seen and heard, her determination to pursue the truth, her willingness to sacrifice for her beliefs. The film was successful, reaching audiences far beyond academic circles. It was screened in high schools and colleges. It was featured on streaming platforms. It inspired other researchers to look more carefully at forgotten documents and overlooked histories. But for Sarah, the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. In 2020, nearly 40 years after the documents had first been discovered in the dusty warehouse at Fort Benning, the Coca-Cola company released an official statement acknowledging the historical record that Sarah had uncovered. The Coca-Cola company, the statement read, acknowledges that during World War II, our products were provided to military personnel and in some cases to prisoners of war. We recognize that this history is complex, and we are committed to understanding and acknowledging all aspects of our company's past, including those that are difficult or uncomfortable. We are grateful to the historians and researchers who have worked to uncover and document this history, ensuring that we understand our past accurately and completely. It was not an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a recognition that what Sarah had spent decades fighting to establish, the truth about Coca-Cola and Japanese prisoners of war, was now part of the official historical record. Sarah received the statement from a journalist who asked for her response. She thought carefully before answering. "What matters," Sarah said, "is not whether a corporation acknowledges its history. What matters is that the truth is now documented and available for anyone to discover. What matters is that students learning about World War II can now understand that the war was not just about military battles, but also about commerce, psychology, and power. What matters is that the voices of people like Kenji Takahashi, who experienced this history firsthand, have been preserved and heard." She paused, then added, "I spent most of my adult life trying to tell this story. I was ignored, dismissed, and isolated for many years. But I kept asking questions, I kept pursuing the truth. And now, finally, that truth is part of the historical record. That is enough. That is more than enough." In the years that followed, Sarah continued to write and teach. She became a mentor to young historians, encouraging them to question official narratives and to pursue truths that might be uncomfortable or controversial. She worked with the National Archives to ensure that the documents she had discovered were properly preserved and made available to researchers. She collaborated with international historians to explore similar patterns of corporate influence in other countries during the post-war period. But she also knew that her most important work was behind her. She had uncovered a truth that had been hidden. She had shared that truth with the world. She had changed, in some small but meaningful way, how people understood history. And that was the legacy she left behind, not the articles or the books or the documentaries, but the simple insistence that truth matters, that one person can make a difference, and that it is always worth the cost to ask the difficult questions and pursue the hidden truths that shape our understanding of the world. As Sarah entered her 70s, she lived a quiet life in Chapel Hill, surrounded by books and memories and the knowledge that she had lived according to her values. She had sacrificed career advancement, had endured years of isolation and rejection, had lived with uncertainty and occasional fear. But she had also lived with purpose. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing anyone could ask for.